It was a quiet autumn morning in San Vicente, a small coastal town with streets lined with old houses and century-old trees. Mrs. Ismenia, a 78-year-old widow, was known in the neighborhood as a woman with strong opinions and strict habits. She had always been that way, raised in a time when things seemed simpler, or at least that's how she liked to remember it. Mrs. Ismenia lived alone in a two-story house, a family inheritance. Her mornings were marked by an unchanging routine. Having coffee on the porch, reading the local newspaper, and taking a walk through the park next to her home. It was during one of these morning walks that she spotted something that, to her, seemed completely out of place. On a wooden bench under the shade of an old oak tree sat a young black woman, apparently in her 30s, holding a very fair-skinned baby in her arms. The scene, which might have seemed ordinary to anyone else, provoked in Mrs. Ismenia a feeling of discomfort and suspicion. How can a black woman have a white baby? She thought, her eyes narrowing and her heart racing. Without a second thought, Mrs. Ismenia grabbed her phone and, with trembling hands, called the police. As she spoke, she watched the young mother gently rocking the child, which only made her more convinced that something was wrong. The dispatcher on the other end of the line responded quickly, promising to send a patrol car to check the situation. The elderly woman waited, watching every passing minute, certain that she was doing the right thing. When the patrol car finally arrived, two officers got out and walked toward the young woman, who looked at them in surprise. Mrs. Ismenia, on the other side of the park, stayed in her spot, waiting to see justice served. But as the officers spoke with the young woman, Mrs. Ismenia began to notice something different. The woman's face showed no signs of guilt or nervousness, but rather surprise and eventually deep sadness. After a brief conversation, the officers turned to leave, without taking any action that confirmed Mrs. Ismenia's suspicions. One of them, as he passed by the elderly lady, gently reprimanded her. "Ma'am, you should be sure before making this kind of report." Confused and feeling a twinge of shame, Mrs. Ismenia quickly decided to return home. However, the walk back seemed longer than ever. The expression on the young mother's face, the way she held her child. Something about that scene began to disturb Mrs. Ismenia in a way she couldn't explain. When she got home, she sat in her living room chair, her thoughts muddled. For the first time in many years, something inside her felt out of place, and the feeling was anything but pleasant. The days that followed were restless for Mrs. Ismenia. She couldn't shake the image of the young woman with the baby from her mind. The questions that had seemed so obvious before were now turning into troubling doubts. Why was that baby with her? And what if, after all, the child really was hers? But how could that be possible? Each of these questions gnawed at the tranquility she had always prized. Mrs. Ismenia tried to resume her routine, but things were no longer the same. Every time she walked through the park, her eyes involuntarily searched for the young mother and her baby. However, she didn't see them again. This absence only increased her discomfort. One afternoon, while organizing old family photos, Ismenia found an image that made her stop. It was an old photo of her grandson, Rodrigo, as a baby. He was blonde, with very fair skin, similar to the baby she had seen in the park. The resemblance struck her like a blow, and something inside her began to break. Would her grandson, if seen in the arms of someone like that young woman, also be the subject of suspicion? Unable to stop her thoughts, she decided to leave the house, heading to the park once again. It was as if something was pulling her, a need to confront what was bothering her so much. Upon arriving, she saw the woman and the baby from a distance, once again seated on the bench under the old oak tree. Mrs. Ismenia hesitated, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She wasn't sure what to say or why she was approaching. She felt vulnerable in a way that was uncommon for her. However, before she could reconsider, her feet had already carried her close to the young woman. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice a little shaky. The young woman looked up, surprised to see the elderly lady who had clearly reported her to the police days before. Her expression was serious, but there was no hostility. "Good afternoon," she replied, in a controlled tone. Mrs. Ismenia didn't know where to begin, so she remained silent for a moment, observing the baby in the young woman's lap. He was sleeping, his face serene. That sight calmed her somewhat, and she finally found the words. I would like to apologize," she began, not sure how to continue. "I think I made a mistake." The young woman blinked, surprised, but kept silent, waiting for Mrs. Ismenia to explain. She sensed there was more behind the elderly woman's approach, something beyond a simple apology. "When I saw you here, days ago with that baby, I thought terrible things. I made wrong assumptions and called the police." Ismenia felt the weight of her words as she spoke them. "Now I see that I may have been unfair. I'm trying to understand." The woman took a deep breath before responding, her tone firm but not aggressive. "My name is Adriana. And yes, this baby is my son, Raphael. He's adopted." Adriana watched the reactions on the elderly woman's face, which ranged from surprise to shame. "I know what you must have thought. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time something like this has happened." Mrs. Ismenia felt a knot form in her throat. She had never imagined that her actions could have such a profound and painful impact. And there, before her, was the truth that had troubled her so much. The child was indeed Adriana's son, and the realization that she had been so cruelly wrong hit her hard. I'm so sorry," murmured Ismenia, lowering her eyes. "I didn't know." Adriana observed her for a moment, evaluating the sincerity of those words. She knew that the elderly lady in front of her was a representation of a type of prejudice she faced daily, but she also noticed something else. Something in Mrs. Ismenia's expression told her that this was an opportunity, perhaps a chance to open a conversation, to change a mindset. "I accept your apology," Adriana said calmly. "But I would also like you to understand what it means for me and my son to live in a world where judgments are made based only on appearance." Mrs. Ismenia felt the words sink deep. What should have been a simple apology was turning into something much bigger, something that could change the way she viewed the world. Adriana, sensing the elderly woman's internal conflict, offered what could be the start of a bridge. "If you'd like, we can talk more about this. I don't expect to change your way of thinking overnight, but maybe we can start to understand each other better." Mrs. Ismenia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. She didn't know where that conversation would lead, but something told her she was taking the first step toward a truth that, until then, she had never allowed herself to face. In the days that followed, Mrs. Ismenia couldn't stop thinking about Adriana and Raphael. Adriana's proposal to continue the conversation seemed like a unique opportunity, something she never imagined she would accept. However, there was a part of her that was curious, maybe even hopeful, that this dialogue could bring some peace to her restless heart. Finally, after much reflection, Mrs. Ismenia decided to visit Adriana. The next morning, with her heart racing, she dressed more carefully than usual and left her house, taking the path toward the park. Upon arriving, she saw Adriana again on the same bench, this time reading a book while Raphael slept in his stroller. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Ismenia approached. "Adriana," she called out, a bit hesitantly. Adriana looked up from her book and, recognizing the elderly lady, gave her a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Ismenia. I'm glad you came." I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I'd like to continue that conversation if you don't mind." Adriana indicated the empty space beside her on the bench, inviting her to sit. Mrs. Ismenia accepted, though she still felt a bit uncomfortable. After a moment of silence, Adriana began. "I think what scares people the most is what they don't know. My mom always used to say that. And I know that, for you, my situation must be something very different from what you're used to seeing." Mrs. Ismenia nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "Yes, it's true. I don't know much about adoption, especially when it involves differences in skin color. That's never been part of my world." Adriana smiled, understanding. "And I get that. But I want you to know that, to me, Raphael is my son, just as much as if he had been born to me. The love I have for him isn't any less because of the color of his skin." Adriana paused, watching the thoughtful expression on Mrs. Ismenia's face before continuing. "When I decided to adopt, I knew there would be challenges. But what matters is that he's loved, cared for, and has everything he needs. The color of his skin is just a detail, but unfortunately, people often make it into something bigger." Mrs. Ismenia remained silent, pondering what Adriana had said. There was a certain discomfort in her words, a feeling that everything she believed was being challenged. But at the same time, something inside her was beginning to open up to this new perspective. I understand better now. Or at least I'm trying," Mrs. Ismenia responded honestly. "I always thought the world was simpler, but I see I was wrong." Adriana nodded. "The world is complicated, Mrs. Ismenia, but that's exactly why we need to try to understand it, a little bit at a time. When you called the police, I was very hurt, but I also understood that it was the reaction of someone who didn't know. That's why I'm here, willing to talk and help you understand." "I appreciate that, Adriana," Mrs. Ismenia replied, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I think I have a lot to learn still." And so, what began as a simple exchange of words turned into a routine. Mrs. Ismenia and Adriana started meeting in the park frequently, each bringing something new to the conversation. Adriana talked about her adoption journey, the challenges she faced, and the joy she discovered in being Raphael's mother. Mrs. Ismenia, on the other hand, began sharing her own stories, the difficulties she had faced over the years, and how much the world had changed since she was young. As the weeks passed, an unlikely friendship began to form. Mrs. Ismenia, who had once been lonely and stuck in her own convictions, started to realize that the world around her was much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. And for the first time in years, she felt that she was truly changing. One of those afternoons in the park, while Adriana and Mrs. Ismenia were chatting animatedly, something unexpected happened. A woman approached them, visibly nervous. She was fair-skinned, blonde, and elegantly dressed. When she stopped in front of them, Adriana and Mrs. Ismenia fell silent, waiting to hear what she had to say. "Excuse me, but I needed to come here," the woman began, her voice a bit shaky. "My name is Clara, and I'm Raphael's biological mother." Time seemed to stop. Mrs. Ismenia felt her heart race, while Adriana widened her eyes in shock. "What do you mean?" Adriana asked, her voice faltering. Clara looked at the ground for a moment before lifting her eyes, now filled with tears. "When I got pregnant with Raphael, I was in a very difficult situation. I couldn't take care of him, and I ended up giving him up for adoption. But I always knew he was in good hands." She paused, wiping away the tears. "However, what I didn't expect was to miss him so much. I tried to move on with my life, but I never managed to forget my son." Adriana was stunned, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Ismenia, beside her, felt a wave of empathy for this woman who was clearly suffering. "I didn't come here to take him back," Clara said quickly, noticing the tension in the air. "I just wanted to meet the woman who is raising my son, and, if it's possible, have some kind of contact with him. I know this is too much to ask, but I had to try." Adriana looked at Raphael, still sleeping in the stroller, and then at Clara. The idea of allowing Raphael's biological mother to be in his life was something she had never considered before. But looking at Clara, Adriana realized how sincere she was. Mrs. Ismenia watched the scene, feeling deep admiration for Adriana. She knew the decision Adriana was about to make wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that, regardless of the choice, Adriana would put Raphael's well-being above everything else. Finally, after a long silence, Adriana spoke. "Clara, I don't know what to say. This is a lot to process. But if you're willing to take it slow, I think we can try to make this work. Raphael is my priority, and everything I do is for his well-being. If you want to be part of his life, we need to be very careful." Clara nodded, looking relieved. "I understand, and I'm grateful that you're giving me this chance. I just want to meet him, and if he wants, be around." Mrs. Ismenia felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Seeing two women, so different yet united by their love for a child, finding a way to make something so difficult work filled her with hope. And at that moment, she realized that this was just the beginning of a new journey, not only for Adriana and Clara, but also for her. Over time, Clara began to meet regularly with Adriana and Raphael. At first, the visits were brief, with Clara watching Raphael from a distance while Adriana remained beside him, protective. Gradually, Raphael, still small, began to get used to Clara's presence. He didn't understand the complexity of the situation, but he felt comfortable around this new person who, strangely, seemed so interested in him. Adriana, for her part, found herself torn. The instinct to protect Raphael was strong, but she also saw the genuine pain in Clara's eyes, who clearly just wanted a small place in her son's life. Adriana decided that if it could somehow benefit Raphael, it would be worth trying. Mrs. Ismenia, who continued to meet Adriana in the park, watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and concern. She knew that the feelings of everyone involved were deep and complicated, and she didn't want anything bad to happen. However, she also saw Adriana's emotional growth in allowing Clara to be part of Raphael's life. And that, for Ismenia, was a testament to how far Adriana had come as a person and as a mother. One afternoon, after one of these visits, Adriana and Mrs. Ismenia were sitting on the park bench, watching Raphael play on the grass. "You're very brave, Adriana," said Mrs. Ismenia, breaking the silence. Adriana smiled, but there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I don't know if bravery is the right word. Sometimes I feel so insecure. But I know I have to do what's right for Raphael. He has the right to know his story, his origin. And Clara, she just wants to be part of that, in a way that doesn't hurt him." Mrs. Ismenia nodded, reflecting on her own changes. She remembered how she reacted initially, full of prejudice and fears, and how Adriana had helped her see the world differently. "You've taught me a lot, Adriana. I never thought I could change my way of seeing things so much," admitted Mrs. Ismenia, with a touch of emotion in her voice. "I was so closed off in my own beliefs my whole life. I never imagined I could learn something new, especially at my age." Adriana looked at her with affection. "That's how life is, Mrs. Ismenia. We're always learning, no matter how old we are. And you've also taught me a lot. Your willingness to understand and change was something I never expected." As they talked, Clara appeared in the park. She waved at both of them and approached slowly, as she always did, respecting the space Adriana had established. Raphael, seeing her, ran towards her with his arms outstretched. "Mommy Clara!" he exclaimed, a mix of innocence and joy. Mrs. Ismenia felt a pang of emotion upon hearing those words. Clara picked Raphael up, her face lit with a smile of genuine happiness. Adriana, though a bit surprised by the nickname Raphael had created, also smiled, feeling that, somehow, everything was falling into place. "I think Raphael just decided what he's going to call you, Clara," Adriana said, laughing softly. Clara, tears in her eyes, hugged Raphael tighter. "That's more than I could have ever asked for." Mrs. Ismenia watched the scene, feeling that, in some way, she too had found something she didn't even know she was looking for. A family, though unconventional, that accepted her and made her feel alive again. As time passed, the dynamic between Adriana, Clara, and Raphael began to settle. They developed a routine that worked for everyone. Adriana continued to be Raphael's mother in every aspect, while Clara became a loving and present figure, a kind of special aunt. Raphael, in turn, seemed happy and well-adjusted, surrounded by love from all sides. However, as in any complex situation, challenges were inevitable. Adriana began to notice that, although everything was going well on the surface, there was a certain tension growing within her. She started to wonder if she was doing the right thing by allowing Clara to be so present. What if, at some point, Raphael started to prefer Clara? The fear of losing her son began to grow, silently but steadily. These feelings culminated in an unexpected argument between Adriana and Clara. It was on a rainy afternoon when Clara arrived at Adriana's house to visit Raphael. Something in Clara's small comments about how Raphael looked like her, or how he acted similarly, triggered a reaction in Adriana. "Clara, I know you're Raphael's biological mother, but he's my son," Adriana exclaimed, her voice louder than she intended. "I'm the one who takes care of him every day, who puts him to bed, who's there when he needs someone. I can't just ignore the fact that this is all very hard for me." Clara was silent for a moment, clearly surprised by Adriana's outburst. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was pain in her words. "Adriana, I never wanted to take your place. I know he's your son. I just want to be present somehow. But if this is causing so much pain, maybe I should step back." Adriana felt the weight of those words. The idea of losing Clara, of pushing her away from Raphael's life, was almost as painful as her fears. But at the same time, she knew she had to protect her heart and her son's. I don't know what's best, Clara," Adriana said, her voice now softer. "I just know that I'm scared." Mrs. Ismenia, who had arrived shortly before and witnessed part of the argument, approached the two. "Maybe what you both need is more time to understand how all this will work," she suggested wisely. "Neither of you is wrong. You're both just trying to do your best in an extremely complicated situation. But you don't need to solve everything at once. Sometimes the answer comes with time." Adriana and Clara remained silent, reflecting on Mrs. Ismenia's words. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that their love for Raphael was what united them. They decided to take a step back, reduce the number of visits, and allow time to help resolve the tensions that had arisen. As Adriana and Clara worked to find a new balance in their relationship, Mrs. Ismenia was also facing her own challenges. The meetings with Adriana, Clara, and Raphael had deeply transformed her view of the world, but that didn't mean the changes were easy. Mrs. Ismenia began to question other aspects of her life. She remembered friends and relatives with whom she had lost contact due to disagreements, many of which, she now realized, were based on prejudices and unfounded assumptions. There was a growing desire within her to reconnect, to right the wrongs of the past. She started with an old friend, Mrs. Lucia, with whom she had quarreled years ago over an inheritance issue. For a long time, Ismenia harbored resentment, but now, all that seemed so small compared to what she had learned from Adriana and Clara. She picked up the phone, hesitant, and called Lucia. The conversation was difficult at first, but over time, Mrs. Ismenia managed to offer a sincere apology and listen to Lucia's perspective. It was a moment of healing for both, and Mrs. Ismenia felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Determined to continue on this path of redemption, Mrs. Ismenia began to get more involved in the community, participating in support groups and offering her help in adoption and social integration projects. She wanted to be part of something bigger, something that helped correct the injustices she had ignored for so long. Over time, the tension between Adriana and Clara began to ease. They found a new rhythm, a balance that worked for both of them and for Raphael. Clara respected the boundaries set by Adriana, and Adriana, in turn, began to trust Clara more, recognizing that Clara's love for Raphael didn't diminish the role of mother she played. Raphael, still young, didn't understand all the nuances, but he felt the love surrounding him and grew up happy, knowing he had not one, but two mothers who loved him deeply. Mrs. Ismenia continued to be part of this unlikely family, bringing with her the wisdom of her years and the newfound empathy she had developed. She became a grandmother to Raphael, something he embraced with joy. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but fate still had one more surprise in store for them. One afternoon, while organizing some old documents, Adriana found a letter from her mother, written years before her death. In the letter, her mother revealed a secret she had kept her entire life. Adriana had been adopted. The revelation was a shock to Adriana. Everything she knew about herself, her identity, was now in question. But at the same time, the discovery brought a new understanding. She realized, on a deep level, what Clara was going through and why she wanted so badly to be in Raphael's life. She also understood that, like Raphael, she had been loved by her adoptive mother in a way that transcended any biological bond. Determined to find answers, Adriana began to investigate her own story. And it was during this investigation that she discovered something even more surprising. Her biological mother, a woman who had disappeared shortly after giving birth, was none other than Mrs. Ismenia. Faced with this truth, Adriana felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Everything made sense now. The inexplicable connection she had always felt with Mrs. Ismenia, the way they had grown close, and how much Mrs. Ismenia had changed over the months. Adriana realized that fate had intertwined their lives in a way neither of them could have predicted. Adriana decided to tell Mrs. Ismenia the truth during a meeting in the park. When she revealed what she had discovered, Mrs. Ismenia was speechless, tears silently rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. I didn't know," Mrs. Ismenia said, her voice choked. "I always knew I had a daughter, but I never knew what happened to her. I thought I had lost everything when I lost her." Adriana hugged her, feeling a deep, unconditional love that she now knew had always been there in some form. "Now I understand why I always felt so connected to you. In some way, our lives have been intertwined from the beginning, and I'm grateful for that." The two stood there, embraced, as Clara and Raphael, who had been called to the meeting, approached. Raphael, not understanding the depth of the moment, simply smiled and ran to the arms of Adriana and Mrs. Ismenia. And so, in a complete circle of love, forgiveness, and redemption, the lives of these three women were united in a family that, though born out of difficult circumstances, was now stronger and more united than ever. The park, which had witnessed so many meetings and partings, now became the symbol of a new beginning. The story of Adriana, Clara, Mrs. Ismenia, and Raphael was a living testament to the fact that love can overcome prejudice, fears, and even time itself. And there, under the ancient trees that had been silent witnesses to their journeys, this new family found the peace they had been seeking.